introduce our guest speaker, journalist and educator Janine Zakaria, who will be speaking on the era of noise, how to read the news in the digital age. Janine has spent nearly 2 decades reporting for national and international news outlets on foreign affairs. She served as the Jerusalem bureau chief of the Washington Post and the State Department correspondent for Bloomberg News. Her reporting has taken her to 40 countries and spanned the 1993 Oslo Peace Accords to the 2011 Arab Spring. Her assignments have included diplomatic trips with President George W. Bush, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and former Central Command Commander William Fallon. She has also been a regular contributor to the New Republic magazine and has appeared as a cable news analyst on MSNBC, CNN, and other networks. For the past 6 years, Ms. Zakaria has been teaching journalism at Stanford University. She also writes regularly about the intersection of technology and national security and media trends for the San Francisco Chronicle, Slate.com, and other news outlets. Our media landscape is currently populated by news sources and imposter outlets abiding by different journalistic standards. How do we distinguish between news, opinion, propaganda, and advertising, and recognize credible fact-based reporting? What is the role of journalism in our democratic society? For today's program, Janine will address these pressing concerns and explore how to navigate this new media landscape. Please join me in welcoming Janine Zakaria.
Good morning, everyone. How you doing? Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. All right. Thank you, Marianne, for this kind invitation to speak today. This is a real pleasure for me to be at Waldorf. I've never been to a Waldorf school. I've heard only amazing things, and I'm so just delighted to have an opportunity to chat with you about a topic that's, well, Marianne heard me talking about on the radio. She said she's very excited about this topic, and I am. It's very urgent. So I think the plan is for me to talk for about 20 minutes and then engage you in conversation. So keep a lot of your questions so I can try and get to as many as I can for another 20 at the end. So I want to focus, I read that here everybody is studying to, quote, become creative thinkers who can take on the complex questions of today's interconnected world. I really liked reading that on your website. So today I want to focus on one of those questions, how to read news in the digital age. So as you're well aware, the internet has brought many benefits to society, but it's also brought great disruption, including to my industry, the news industry. The transformation for most people reading the news in this to reading it on this, sorry, I don't have an iPhone, it's an Android, has happened very quickly. And as a result, everybody's been scrambling to adapt. News consumers, all of us, and journalists themselves. And mostly people have been struggling now to figure out what to trust online. This has become a very big topic. And as my Stanford colleague in the School of Education, Sam Weinberg, says, and I'm paraphrasing here, we're all driving around on the internet without a license. So after graduating from Middlebury, I don't know, you guys probably don't know Middlebury, right? Vermont? Yeah? I'm a big fan of the small liberal arts schools, just as a little aside. So I'm really excited about the focus here on literature too as well. But I spent nearly 2 decades doing beat reporting, as Marianne referenced, internationally and in Washington, D.C. And for the past now almost 7 years, I'm teaching journalism at Stanford to both undergraduate and graduate students. And I tell people when they ask me about my classes that if I once had to just encourage students like you, who are very busy, to read the news, now I need to teach them how to do it. And this has all gotten harder as the internet has become flooded with online content. Credible, fact-based journalism alongside, as Marianne referenced, imposter outlets that are just make it seem like they're reporting news, but they're really just bunk. And the great paradox I want to explore with you this morning is that in this amazing era of unprecedented access to information, where if you want to learn about Kenya today, you can go read like the Nairobi Times or whatever, any corner of the globe, we are living in this unprecedented era of noise. Basically because of one reason. The internet turned everybody into a publisher. It flattened the field, and it made it harder to distinguish what's what. And it's raised a lot of questions. Some of these might be interesting for you if you ever have to do a research paper or whatever. Who are the new gatekeepers for this information? Used to be the newspaper editors, right, who would decide what can get into the newspapers based on a certain set of standards. Now everything's going up on the internet. Is it Facebook's responsibility to act like a publisher and determine what is true or false? Big issue right now. Do universities and academics have a role to play as arbiters? What about the government as regulators? President Trump said he wants to, he's making the attorneys general get together to talk about whether there should be limits put on Google and some of the other social media companies. Or is it our responsibility to learn how to identify what's credible? I'd say we all share in this responsibility, and no one part of society is going to fix this problem. Now, why is this an urgent question to wrestle with? Why bother in one of your very valuable sessions here to listen to me on this? Simply put, I just don't see how our democracy is going to function if we don't restore respect for credible fact-based journalism and teach people how to find real credible news. And I'll explain some ideas of how we're going to do that. But let's define some terms. What is news? Anybody? Anybody want to talk about what they think news is? Current events? Anybody else? Yeah.
Like information about a topic.
Information about a topic. Very good. Very good. Yeah. So there's a little hint in the word. If I had a little board here, I would take away my green board. But so there's a new in the news. That's how you remember it. Something new and noteworthy information, as the gentleman said, especially about recent events, and it impacts whoever your audience is. And of course, you have different kinds of news: sports, entertainment, political. Now, what about fake news? It's a term you hear a lot. In fact, I think it was the most, Collier Dictionary said it was the most frequently used term or #1 term of 2017. 337% increase in use. So fake news, follow me, is news articles that purport to be factual, but which contain intentional misstatements with the intention of arousing passions or attracting viewers or deceiving. Basically made up stories that are often headlined with clickbait. How many people have heard the term clickbait? Or so you all know, right? What's clickbait? Clickbait, yeah.
Clickbait is when someone advertises that you'll get something or you'll be directed to a website you're told to, but it really ends up on some kind of scam page.
Yeah, it's making you click on it because it's like so sensational. You can't help yourself, and then it usually doesn't deliver on whatever you're clicking on.
They basically put you to a false advertising.
Sometimes, or it could just be something really sensational. So President Trump labels, now he uses a different definition of fake news. President Trump labels any story he doesn't like as fake news in order to discredit news outlets. And to leave all of us thinking, I just don't know what to believe. And this is wrong. Now look, I brought this as a little prop. This is the New York Times from, I just grabbed one from my piles, I have many piles. So it happens to be Saturday, August 25th. So this was and remains, in my view, the most credible news source in the United States. But today, large percentages of Americans don't trust it or the rest of the mainstream media, like the Washington Post, my alma mater, or the San Francisco Chronicle. They think some of the stories are made up. And listen, there's plenty to criticize about the New York Times and the Washington Post and others. There's holes in their coverage, headlines that are off, stories missed. But this widespread distrust of one of our core institutions is a relatively new phenomenon. And I want to just explain for you, and I'm sure many of you know this already, what's been lost by transferring from this to the smartphone. Here you have a product that's been curated for you by professional editors, trained journalists, working under a certain set of standards. There's certain things that are happening on this page without you even knowing. Front page, obviously, the most important stories of the day that they want you to, or just amazing investments and reporting they want you to focus on. They've got this on the right column is going to be the most important story of the day. Above the fold is more important than below the fold. The paper is organized in sections, so you know you're going to get, if you're reading the New York Times A section, international, national, metro, and in the back, the opinion pages. That's the most important thing. Now, every newspaper has its own set of the way it's organized, but it was organized for you. And the people who are working at these newspapers, these are kinds of people that ran, like my colleagues, who ran into Tahrir Square in 2011 when there's a revolution. Everybody's running out. They're the ones running to North Carolina right now while everybody's fleeing. These are the kinds of people who work at these newspapers, not enemies of the people, just for the record. They're people who are now, because of social media, friends of mine, being trolled on Twitter. Some colleagues of mine at the New York Times and Washington Post have bodyguards now. We're living in an era where, I was just in Washington last week. The New York Times Washington Bureau has a whole new set of safety procedures that I don't want to detail here, but left me very unnerved. The Washington Post has full-time security in the lobby. So it's gotten, I was an international correspondent. I've been to Iraq, Afghanistan, I've traveled the Middle East. I've gone to dangerous places, and you knew it was dangerous. I never thought it would be dangerous to be a reporter in the United States of America. So I just wanted to give you that without scaring anyone, but just give you a sense of the commitment that many people have to reporting. So what are some of the things, though, if you're saying, I don't believe anything she's saying, I don't believe the New York Times is credible anymore, I don't believe it. So what are some things you should be looking for in a credible fact-based? What makes them different than clickbaity blogs? One, there's a functioning reporter-editor relationship. And the goal of this relationship is to seek and report the truth, not push the conspiracy theory, not just get you to buy something. They really want to do that. Second, they perform the core journalism function, which is what? What's the core journalism function, you think? Besides reporting the news, yeah. Inform, yeah. What else? Yeah.
Tell the truth.
Tell the truth. What else? What do we really got to do, though, with our stories? What's the most important thing? Someone else talk.
Captivate your audience.
You want to do that, too, for sure, because I want them to read what I wrote. What's that? Make it short. Facts. We have to, this is my imaginary person in power here. We got to hold these people accountable. We have to report on city governments and our national government. We got to make sure they're spending our money properly, that they're doing what they say they're doing. Accountability journalism. This is the main thing. And they try to do all this to the best of their abilities. Third, now we're talking about the things that are credible, fact-based news organizations. There's a system. You want to add something?
Oh yeah, so the last one.
Yeah.
Whatever you do, don't copy anyone else's work and don't add in misinformed ideas. If you are misinformed, sometimes they allow you to edit wiki pages, and who knows who doesn't.
Okay, yeah, no plagiarism for sure. Thank you for adding that.
I mean, there's no plagiarism,
Yeah.
but there's also don't add misinformed information. If some random guy on the street finds a wiki,
Right, you can't just add stuff if you're working at a credible, because you have that functioning reporter-editor relationship. Third, there's a system of fact-checking, apropos what the gentleman's saying, and verifying the information. And there's strict rules on anonymous sources. So this has become a topic of big conversation right now. I don't know if you guys are following everything going on with anonymous sources. Anonymous sources, unnamed. So it's something, you're reading a story, it says senior U.S. official, person familiar with events. If you're working at a credible fact-based news organization, there's a whole process for getting that approved. And really, most often, you don't get it approved. The editor will say, no, can't do it. You do it when you're reporting on people that if you can't give them anonymity, you can't report the story, and it's maximum public interest. You follow? So an unnamed source is not a made-up source. Now, it doesn't mean it hasn't happened. After this, well, don't after this, because you can't take out your phone until 3:15. But at 3:15, okay, Google the New York Times Jason Blair, or Janet Cook of the Washington Post, or the New Republic Stephen Glass, or USA Today's Jack Kelly. These are the rare exceptions of reporters who lost their job, lost all their credibility, never worked in journalism again because they made up, not unnamed people, but they just made up people. Okay, it's very, very, very rare. Most importantly, number 4, what a credible fact-based journalism news organization is, when they make mistakes, and there will be mistakes, these publications print corrections and they explain in full what went wrong and why the error occurred. Okay, so a mistake is not evidence of fake news. A mistake corrected properly is evidence of it's the opposite. You got it? Okay. So those are 4 things that you can really be thinking about. Now let me just tell you something about, for a real reporter, what a correction means. A correction means stomach ache. I'm shaking. I'm like terrified. I'm like, I can't sleep. Maybe I'm crying. Because for a real credible journalist, it's the worst thing that can happen, to get something wrong. Why is it the worst thing that can happen? Because if you're a real credible journalist, the only thing you have is your credibility. And if you made a mistake, guess what? People aren't going to want to talk to you, your sources, your editors are going to regard you differently. There's a huge cost. Now, one of the media trends I've noticed over the last couple of years of teaching is that people your age, especially, a little older, are getting more forgiving of mistakes. So let me just give you an example, and it's sort of a sad example, so bear with me. In December 2012, so you were much younger, obviously, I was driving in my car, I was listening to CNN on Sirius XM, and I had to pull over because there had just been a shooting at an elementary school in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, Sandy Hook Elementary School. And I was listening to Don Lemon on CNN, and some of you may, if you ever watch CNN, you know who Don Lemon is, right? He's just one of the anchors, and I pulled over when he said this, quote, "This is hard, and I can speak for myself and for Deb Fayrick's coverage. She was the reporter on the scene, he was in the studio. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to try and be as respectful, as comforting, as calm as possible. Sometimes we won't get it right. We won't get all the names right, meaning the names of the children. And sometimes the information is coming in fast. We may get that wrong, so please bear with us." So what's your reaction to that? Anybody? Does it make sense? He's saying we're not going to get it right. He's putting out the disclaimer, right? Good? Not good? Who thinks good? Who thinks I have stomachache? Not good. You see, okay, so more are saying good. I'm the stomachache, obviously. I kind of, because, they are going to get it wrong. But when you're dealing with a school shooting with little kids, you got to pause. And so one of the big things that's happening and why I think journalism is losing credibility is because they're racing. They're racing out because of Twitter. They want to be first. And they're prioritizing speed over accuracy. So one of the things I try to teach my students, I was trained at Reuters, the news agency, where they literally would put the times up when our stories would hit compared to our competitors. And that was one of the metrics we were judged on in the late 90s. It's much worse to have to do a correction than to be a few seconds after the next person. So I'm hoping, and I'm worried that one of the trends is, though, that journalists are prioritizing speed over accuracy. Now, another problem that's happened, and Marianne and I talked about it, that she wanted me to address with you, is when you're reading things online, it's harder sometimes to tell what's news and what's opinion. Not so hard if you're reading from the New York Times or the Washington Post. If you read a column from Bret Stephens in the New York Times, it says opinion. Look for that label if you're reading it online. It's much easier in the newspaper to see it, but look, know what you're reading, whether it's an opinion or a news story. Be sensitive to how they're classified. Now, what happens if you come across a site you don't know? Someone sent it to you on Snapchat, or you guys don't post stories on Instagram, I know. I tried to get my students to do that, and they were like, "Oh, no, Janine, I can't do that." So I know that you use different media for different things, but you come across a site that you don't know, it's not the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever, it's really important to get out of that site and do what my colleague Sam Weinberg says, do what's called lateral reading. Don't spend a lot of time looking through it. Don't be like, "Oh, there's citations there, it looks legit. Oh, look, they have a graph. Oh, that's cool." Get out of it and see what it is. Read a little bit about the site. Go into Google or whatever and just read about it. Know what it is. Don't waste time because you're getting flooded. We're all getting flooded. Do you guys feel flooded with information? It's too much. We don't have enough time. You have to do a lot of things here. You don't want to waste time on a site that's not worth your time. Try and know what it is. Now, another thing to be aware of is called native advertising. Has anybody heard this term? It's a relatively new term. Another term you need to leave here if you forget everything else I said. Remember this: sponsored content. Okay? Do you ever see that on a? Okay, you don't always notice it. Okay, if I had the projector here, I'd show you. It looks like a news article. And you know why it looks like a news article? Because the people writing sponsored content, which is a fancy word for paid ads now, are real journalists. The New York Times has its own, to my great horror, division called T-Brand Studios, where they, like Delta Airlines, will come to them and say, "We want to do a story about travel, an ad that look about travel," but really it's pushing Delta. Okay, so you have to. Those things are labeled in the real newspaper, sponsored content. Make sure you know what that is, okay? Because that's basically an ad that looks like news. They're growing, and it's much harder. They're mixed in. This is me going through my Facebook or Twitter feed, right? They're mixed in, sponsored content, real credible news story, something made up by somebody, It's harder, so look for that. Now, what about cable news? And this may be for your parents who may be watching more than you. I don't know how many you curl up with cable news at night. Probably not that many. But here's what you can tell your parents, okay? If they're only watching Fox or MSNBC or CNN between the hours of 8 and 11, and that's how they're getting their news only, that is not a healthy news diet. You have to think about cable news, especially in the nighttime right now, as talk radio on TV. A lot of opinion, a lot of yelling, not so much substantive reporting. Some shows, yes, but you can't, and if you want to watch it because it's infotainment, it's fun to watch, these shows are not going away. They're making a ton of money for the networks, but it's not a healthy news diet. Read a credible news source before that. Now, I really want to talk to you and hear if you have concerns on this topic. So let me just say a few things, and then we can go into more of the Q&A. It's kind of a little baby homework assignment. Not really. First, I've said it a couple times. Don't just click on every news story that comes on your feed. Be more discerning about the source and make sure you get a healthy diet every day of local, national, and international news so that you're informed citizens. I don't know how, I want everybody to, I know you're going to say, Janine, I don't have time. I have so much to do. I don't have time to read. Why should I read international? Why should I care what's going on in Myanmar right now? And to me, this is like, I can't tell you how distressing it is for me, because I feel that if we don't all know what's going on, or at least a little bit around the world, we're not going to be smart voters, and we're just not going to be, our democracy is going to depend on us all getting a little bit of good, credible information about the world. Second, I don't know, you buy or your parents need to buy subscriptions to credible fact-based news. You know, nobody ever balked at having to pay for a real newspaper, but there's the sense that because you're reading it online, you don't need to pay for it. And it used to be that newspapers got 80% of their revenue from advertising and 20% from subscriptions. And now that's flipped. So 20% from, sorry, 20% from advertising and 80% from subscriptions. And guess what? People aren't buying enough subscriptions. So guess what? Journalists are sometimes losing their jobs. So guess what? We don't have as much accountability journalism, right? So for an example, you saw there was this hurricane in North Carolina? Yeah. So there's a big hurricane in North Carolina. North Carolina is underwater right now. Last time there was a direct hit on North Carolina was 1999, and the main newspaper in North Carolina, the Raleigh News and Observer, had 250 people working in their newsroom. Now Hurricane Florence comes through and they have 65 total. So that's everybody, the editors, the reporters, and everything. So they're trying to do the same amount of work and reporting with many less resources. Same thing here. San Jose Mercury News used to be, when I was in college, like, oh, if I could work for the San Jose Mercury News. You know, like this was such a top paper. They used to have someone covering every town in the peninsula. I lived in Redwood City. They had someone covering Redwood City full time. Now they've got one or two people running up and down the peninsula, you know, going crazy. Some states don't have a reporter in Washington anymore. So if you live in Alaska, there's nobody covering Washington right now. There's nobody covering the senators from Alaska. There's nobody covering oil legislation. So we've got a problem. The third thing you can do is, you know, like right now I was driving up, they've got the fundraising drive, you know. It's annoying, you want to switch off anybody, 88.5. Contribute to public media because they're still trying to do news that's not corrupted by way too much opinion and too much sensationalism. And fourth, you already did this. Fourth thing I like to recommend is to meet a local journalist. Meet somebody who can talk about how it actually works. Because if you know a journalist, you're less likely to say, that's a fake person, right? You met them, they're not fake. It's not doing fake work. Let me end with something very corny, a little bit. You probably all heard this quote many times from Thomas Jefferson, right? Do you all know this quote? So Thomas Jefferson suffered from fake news, by the way. They wrote fake news about Thomas Jefferson. They just didn't go crazy on Facebook or Twitter back then. It was limited. Now, but he said, nevertheless, 1787, quote, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. But I should mean that every man," and let's add every gender, now we'll update a little, "should receive those papers and be capable of reading them." And I hope that my brief remarks this morning will help you do that. Thanks very much. I think we have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So if anybody has any questions about anything at all, happy to take them. Please pass the mic around, Marianne, or just stand up? Yeah. You want to stand up and ask your question so I can hear you?
So, how did you become a journalist? Like, it's a brief summary.
Yeah, sure. I cut it because I didn't have enough time. I usually start with my bio, so that's a totally relevant question. So I told you I went to Middlebury College. small liberal arts school in Vermont, and I always wanted to be a journalist. I couldn't think of a better job. Where else are you going to get paid to go and interview people and talk to them and do something different every day, right? And I always wanted to do something international. I was totally into languages, and I studied Chinese at Middlebury for a little while, but then I went to Israel and taught to drop Chinese, and Bai Lauscher was so mad at me, and French. I want to go around the world. So it's a great profession. So after, I always did an internship. So those of you who are interested, you should do internships at real newspapers. I got an internship at a magazine in Jerusalem when I graduated. Meanwhile, I was supposed to go to Columbia. I got accepted for the master's program in journalism, but I deferred, and then I ended up getting hired by this magazine. So I never went to Columbia, still have a credit. But I couldn't see going back to New York to study Middle Eastern journalism when I was working now as a journalist in the Middle East. So I did that, and then I went to work for Reuters, and then I went to work for Jerusalem Post, and then I worked for Bloomberg, covering with Hillary Clinton, but more actually with Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice for 4 years. And just one job led to another. And so that's how I got into it. Yeah. Anybody here interested in journalism? I'm kind of curious. Not really? A little bit? So let me just tell you something really briefly, a little public service announcement. Even though there are those cutbacks I talked about, there are still jobs in journalism. You just need more skills than you needed when I did it. So at Stanford, we're training students to do, record and write. That's what I teach. There's multimedia, so video, photography, 360 video now, so immersive journalism. And the big one right now is data journalism. So I don't know how much you're learning Excel and all these things, but finding data, learning how to identify data and databases, and you have a professional database person right here in front of me, and taking that data and using it for reporting and also doing data visualization. So you need to do everything now. Yeah. And podcasts also, and there's so much. Yeah. Yeah.
If you would suggest to read just one source, what source would that be?
One source that you should read. I mean, look, I love the New York Times, but I'm also reading the Wall Street Journal right now, and I'm reading the Washington Post. I think the San Francisco Chronicle. I think any of these, and if you don't like any of those, then you can set a Google News alert for yourself just to get stories from the AP or from Reuters. Like these are the most credible, like Newswire. So any of those are good. I love the BBC as well. They also have a wonderful website interface. There are things called, there's a lot of my student kids, not my real kids, they like the Skim, which gives them like, does anybody know what the Skim is? It gives you like the headlines of different things. It's really quick because everybody's busy. So I think those are a couple of really good options. Yeah. Anything else? Anything else? I'll go in the back.
Can you speak a little to bias in news versus fake news?
So bias versus fake news. So people see bias a lot in different news outlets, and so they'll think that they're coming at it. News organizations like the New York Times are biased toward liberal, or the Wall Street Journal, I guess, would be biased towards conservative, whatever. And my opinion is that I think that there are sometimes when there's poor judgment at a mainstream news outlet that I don't think is conscious bias. So, for example, the New York Times had a really big egg on its face a couple days ago, all right? They had a story that had the headline something like, the State Department spent $52,000 on curtains for Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations apartment in Manhattan, at a time when the State Department was cutting a lot of programs. And the story, I didn't like the story as a former State Department correspondent, because when you read deeply, it was like the Obama administration had signed off on this. So it was like a security thing or whatever, special curtains, I don't know, the ones that motorized, I don't know, curtains, I can, but and they had to do an editor's correction, an editor's clarification, editor's note, because the way they had framed the story and the headline and the picture made it seem like Nikki Haley was like these other people, like Ben Carson with his really expensive dining room table, or Scott Pruitt with his private audio sound room or whatever, a lot of corruption that's been in this administration. And so they corrected it, right? But I think in that place, they were looking, right? And so I wouldn't call it bias. I would call it like they were just in the wrong zone. Now, fake news, See, so I think generally that in the news pages, if you read a news story, the Times or the Post or the Journal, which is much more conservative, they're all pretty similar. And then you have the op-ed pages, the editorial pages, where you see obviously complete divergence. Sometimes though, there's a bias towards, is it a bias if they're not covering certain communities of color, certain communities of disadvantaged communities, if they're writing stories that only appeal to their readers? That's holes in their coverage too. But sometimes people see bias where I don't think there is bias. But one thing another thing that you could look for, and unfortunately the Times doesn't have this, and I think it's a great tragedy. They used to have something called a public editor or an ombudsman. This is a person whose job it is to critique, to look for examples of bias when it comes out. And the New York Times said, we don't need it anymore because anybody can write to us online. You need it all the more so because everything's flooding. You have to make sense of those comments. So, but the Washington Post still has one, and someone you could look up. Her name is Margaret Sullivan. She's a fantastic media critic. She'll look for things like that. Yeah, in the back.
What's your opinion of Al Jazeera?
Al Jazeera, the truth is, I used to watch it, and then it used to be, I think, available, and I don't know if it's still available anymore. I think they got rid of it when they got rid of that channel, right?
Well, I used to watch it on Link.
Yeah, and so I think for the most part, I mean, Al Jazeera, obviously after 9/11, a lot of people were concerned about, I remember at that time, Condi and President Bush, they were concerned about the way it was reporting on Al-Qaeda and all these things, but it emerged, Al Jazeera America emerged as a very high-quality news outlet, in my opinion. And I felt like it was one of the channels that actually did real news reporting. So I think it's a shame that, unless it's available, and I don't know.
I haven't seen it lately.
I think you can probably watch it online. They hired a lot of real journalists. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I hear them saying, they will do it again, but I don't see them publishing or
So the question is about New York Times and the Washington Post and others. The speaker thinks that they're doing a lot of government, what was the word you used? Mouthpiece. So I've only been doing this now 20, 25 years, right? But I've never seen a more vitriolic relationship or contentious relationship between the press and the government than we have right now, okay? It's really bad because of all the accountability journalism, especially on the Russia story right now, right? In particular, this president. Now, on your other question, so it's gotten to the point where they're canceling White House briefings, journalists are not being invited on trips, certain journalists are being singled out. I mean, so it's gotten, and journalists are really struggling with how hard to push back because you want to have your access to these officials, but on the other hand, you have to write about these people. It's like one of the most fundamental, interesting things about journalism. The people you rely on for information are the people you're writing about. So if you're doing a good job, sometimes they're going to be really mad at you. So by the way, if you're ever a journalist and that happens, you have to ask them, did I get anything wrong here? That's the only thing you care about, really. If they're going to be mad at you, that's something else. So I think that you're right in terms of the war reporting. For me, what I'm more concerned about is there's just not enough of it, right? We have major military operations going on right now in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, all these places. And we have soldiers who are still dying. When was the last time you put on the news, any channel, and saw something about that? Any at all? No. And so these, to me, are very important stories that are undercovered. But I think that they have learned the lessons of Iraq, and I mean, although you see it a little bit when you're talking about Iran and we're thinking, are we going to go to war with Iran? You see, there's not always as much skepticism. So I can see why you'd be concerned, but I think for the moment, I'm more concerned about that underreporting. And Marianne, 2 more minutes, 3 more minutes.
Okay.
I don't feel. Yeah, Marianne's got a question.
What do you think of Rachel Maddow?
What do I think of Rachel Maddow? I think that Rachel Maddow is, in many ways, doing a great service to the country because she's linking together and she's digging up a lot of things and about the Russia scandal, potential possible Russia scandal. Basically what she's doing every day is reporting on the possibility that the President of the United States is a Russian agent. Okay? That's basically what she's doing every day. And so she's going all in with that, and she's getting a lot of criticism for it. Now, do I think sometimes, when I'm watching her, do I think she went too far there? She doesn't have the goods on this? You know, yes. And sometimes, you know, just personally, I don't watch it religiously. I would say this though, if you're only watching Rachel Maddow, you're not getting a healthy news diet because she's only doing the Russia story, right? So you need other, it's a big story, it happens to be a big story, the Mueller investigation into what happened in the 2016 election. I mean, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but we're about to maybe be on the cusp of one of the biggest news events that we'll ever experience in your lifetimes, okay? The way Watergate was for your parents or your grandparents or whoever, and we're coming towards something. Maybe it won't be like that, but there's a good chance. So I think it's important to know like what's out there, and so she'll recap a lot of that. Stylistically, though, I just, you know, it's not always my cup of tea, but you know, it's again, healthy news diet is my recommendation. Yeah.
What do you think when you see an anonymous source cited in a major paper, like the New York Times, and do you think it's credible, and do you think it's right on the person who published anonymously to do that?
So are you talking about the opinion piece or in general? The opinion piece? Okay, so for those of you who may not have been aware, 2 weeks ago, was it 2 weeks? Last week? When was it?
Last week.
Okay, it's a couple days ago. The New York Times published one of its most read pieces ever. That's big. It was like, I don't know, 15 million people or something. An anonymous piece that said, I am part of the resistance, not the left resistance. I am part of the resistance inside the administration. They identified him, her, we don't know, as a senior administration official. And the New York Times said, we're taking this very unusual move of publishing an op-ed anonymously because of the importance of this message for the nation, okay? Very, very controversial decision. So my first reaction was, oh my God. If the New York Times is doing this, this is like cabinet level. This has to be cabinet level because I know these people on the op-ed pages and I know they're just not letting anybody, they're not letting some deputy assistant secretary in commerce publish, because could technically be a senior official, right? Still deputy assistant secretary, right? They're not doing that, right? But I think that, you know, when I talked to a friend of mine when I was in Washington who's on the editorial page of the Washington Post, and you know, we were debating it. I said, do you think the Washington Post would have published it? He said, absolutely. So I think that there's a consensus that what was in that piece was so important that now there's a cost. Nothing's free, right? So when you have a president who's saying that anonymous sources are fake, and the New York Times, this is going to feed that narrative among certain people. So, and then there's the issue of my friends who cover national security in the White House at the Times. They were shocked when the piece hit, because people don't realize this. The news pages are totally separate from the editorial and opinion pages. Different buildings, sometimes different floor. They never see each other. And so they saw this hit the website like everybody else. Now what are they supposed to do? Their job is to figure out who it is. Their job is they want to know who wrote these things. That they're taking papers off the president's desk and doing all these things. Now what are they going to do? The op-ed page just granted anonymity to this guy or girl or whoever. So if you read that Margaret Sullivan I told you about, the public editor of the Washington Post, she said we can only hope that the Washington Post breaks the story of who the person is, just to give them a break, those reporters. So, but there could very well be a situation where Peter Baker, the White House reporter for the New York Times, finds out who wrote it. And the Times is going to have to make a decision. Do we let him publish that, or do we stick with our anonymity pledge to the guy or girl? We don't know. I think it's somebody very senior. So, but I mean, what do I know? It could also, but the thing is, does it matter? What if it's somebody who's a deputy to somebody, and they were in the meetings and saw this? The material is still very important, and I hated how they put up on TV, my imaginary TV here. You know, they were trying to guess who it was. Like, that's not the important thing. The important thing is what was written in the piece. That was the most important thing. And there was not enough focus. I don't know, maybe